Picture this, the cruelest things Viking raiders did to conquered peoples. You guys, I am absolutely obsessed with this story because it completely flips the script on everything we think we know about Vikings. Like, when you think of medieval Europe, you think of Vikings as the ultimate apex predators, right? These are the people who showed up in their longships and entire coastal communities would just panic. They'd see those dragon-headed ships on the horizon, and it was basically game over. The Vikings had this reputation that was absolutely terrifying. They were raiders, they were conquerors, they were explorers who reached North America centuries before Columbus, and they basically reshaped the entire political landscape of medieval Europe. But here's what's absolutely wild. There was this one mysterious group of people living in the far north who not only resisted Viking conquest, but actually made the Vikings so afraid that they would literally turn around and sail away rather than fight them. And the craziest part? These people weren't some massive empire with huge armies. They weren't building castles or wearing heavy armor like the knights we see in movies. No, no, no. These were the Biarmians, and they lived in what is basically the most hostile environment you can imagine. We're talking about the northernmost regions of present-day Finland, northwestern Russia, and the Kola Peninsula, places where the forests are so deep and dark that sunlight barely reaches the ground, where winter lasts for most of the year, and where the cold is so intense it can literally kill you in minutes if you're not prepared. This was their home, and they had turned this frozen wasteland into their ultimate weapon against Viking expansion. Now, before we get into the absolutely insane tactics these people used, and trust me, we're going to talk about psychological warfare that would make modern military strategists jealous. Let me paint you a picture of what the Viking Age was really like. We're talking about the period from 793 to 1066 CE, and during this time, the Vikings weren't just random raiders causing chaos. They were actually running this incredibly sophisticated operation that involved trading, settlement, exploration, and yes, conquest on a scale that was absolutely unprecedented. These weren't just angry barbarians with axes. They were skilled farmers, master craftsmen, incredible navigators, and they had maritime technology that was literally centuries ahead of everyone else. Think about this for a second. While most of medieval Europe was still figuring out basic agriculture, the Vikings had developed ships that could sail across oceans and navigate shallow rivers. They could literally sail from Scandinavia, go down rivers deep into Eastern Europe, and pop up in places like Kiev or even Constantinople. They reached North America, they established trading posts from Greenland to the Middle East, and by the 9th century, they were basically the dominant force in Northern European politics. Their expansion was at fever pitch, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. But here's where it gets interesting. Even at the height of their power, there were certain places where Vikings just didn't go. And I'm not talking about places that were too well defended or too poor to bother with. I'm talking about places where the geography, the climate, and the local resistance made Norse conquest not just difficult, but absolutely terrifying. And at the top of that list was Bjarmaland, the shadowy territory of the Biarmians that existed somewhere between the known world and what the Vikings' leader, ally, believed was the supernatural realm. You guys, when I first started researching this story, I found this fragmentary runic inscription near Trondheim that dates back to 950 CE, and it just says, "Beware the watchers in the White Forest." That's it, T. No explanation, no context, just this ominous warning carved in stone by people who were supposed to be the most fearless warriors in Europe. That should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously the Vikings took the Biarmian threat. So who were these Biarmians? And what made them so different from everyone else the Vikings had encountered? Well, first of all, they were masters of environmental warfare in a way that was absolutely revolutionary for medieval times. While the Vikings were incredible at sea and pretty good on land in temperate climates, the Biarmians had spent generations perfecting survival and combat techniques in conditions that would literally kill most people. We're talking about profound silence and harshness of snow-covered forests where the temperature could drop so low that your breath would freeze instantly, where the snow was so deep you couldn't move without proper equipment, and where one wrong step could mean death. But the Biarmians didn't just survive in this environment, they thrived in it. They had developed mobility technologies that were absolutely mind-blowing for the time period. We're talking about advanced ski and snowshoe designs that let them move across snow like they were flying, specialized sleds that could carry supplies and weapons efficiently across any terrain. And most importantly, they remained active year-round, even in the harshest months when most people would be huddled around fires just trying to survive. Their clothing technology was so advanced that they could spend days in sub-zero temperatures and remain perfectly comfortable, using layered furs and plant fibers and combinations that provided superior insulation to anything the Vikings had. And their shelter construction? Absolutely genius. They could rapidly assemble and disassemble shelters that were perfectly adapted for mobility, which meant they could basically appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. They had transformed every single environmental challenge of their homeland into a tactical advantage, and that's what made them so incredibly dangerous to any invading force. But here's where it gets really wild. The Bjarmians had completely rejected the Viking paradigm of warfare. While Vikings were all about direct confrontation, personal prowess, and honor in battle, the Bjarmians had developed what was basically the medieval equivalent of advanced asymmetric warfare. They had 5 key principles that guided everything they did, and these principles were so effective that they basically made Viking-style conquest impossible in their territory. First principle: absolute avoidance of direct confrontation. The Bjarmians would never meet Vikings in open battle, where the Vikings could use their superior numbers, equipment, and battle experience. Instead, they focused exclusively on asymmetric warfare tactics that played to their strengths while exploiting Viking weaknesses. Second principle: environmental manipulation. They used the landscape itself as both weapon and shield, turning the harsh climate and difficult terrain into tools that would slowly wear down and demoralize any invading force. They could disappear into forests so dense that Vikings couldn't follow, and they could use the natural features of the land to create ambushes that were absolutely devastating. Third principle, and this is where it gets really interesting: psychological warfare. The Bjarmians cultivated an aura of supernatural mystery and fear that was so effective it became their most powerful weapon. They understood that defeating the Vikings mentally was just as important as defeating them physically, and they were absolute masters at getting into the heads of these supposedly fearless warriors. Fourth principle: targeted elimination. Instead of trying to kill large numbers of Vikings, they focused on precision strikes against leaders, scouts, and sentries. By carefully selecting their targets, they could create maximum disruption with minimal risk to themselves, and they could gradually degrade Viking command and control capabilities until entire expeditions would fall apart. And fifth principle: coordinated withdrawal. The Bjarmians had developed mobility-based retreat strategies that were so sophisticated they could basically vanish whenever they wanted to. They could engage Viking forces, inflict casualties, and then disappear so completely that it was like they had never been there at all. Their weapon technology was perfectly adapted to these principles. Instead of heavy swords and axes like the Vikings used, they relied on lightweight hunting bows that were incredibly accurate at long range, silent spears that could kill without making a sound, and curved, throat-cutting knives that were designed for quick, quiet kills. And the most incredible part? They had secret hunting societies that developed specialized fighters from childhood, creating warriors who were so perfectly adapted to their environment and their tactics that they were basically invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to detect them. But the psychological warfare aspect is what really sets this story apart from anything else in medieval history. The Bjarmians had created this system of constant surveillance that made Vikings feel like they were being watched continuously, even when they couldn't see anyone. Imagine being a Viking warrior, used to being the most feared person in any room, and suddenly you're in this vast, silent forest where you know someone. Yes, watching you, but you can't see them, you can't hear them, and you have no idea when or where they might strike. That kind of psychological pressure would break down even the most hardened warriors over time, and their shamanic practices appeared absolutely alien to the Norse worldview. The Vikings had their own religious beliefs, obviously, but the Bjarmian spiritual practices involved things like mummification techniques that preserved ancestors in what appeared to be a liminal state between life and death. They had ritual ceremonies that could induce trance states and transformational experiences that seemed supernatural to outside observers. And most terrifyingly, they would stage supernatural encounters that were carefully orchestrated to convince Vikings that the Bjarmians actually had supernatural powers. There was even a specific psychological condition that veteran Viking warriors would develop after encountering the Bjarmians. Historians call it the Bjarmian dread. Warriors who had fought successfully across Europe, who had faced every kind of enemy you can imagine, would return from Bjarmian territory as changed men. They would become superstitious, fearful, and reluctant to discuss what they had experienced. Some of them never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of fighting an enemy they couldn't understand or predict. Now you might be wondering, why were the Vikings even bothering with this frozen wasteland in the first place? Well, it turns out that Bjarmian territory was absolutely rich in resources that were incredibly valuable in medieval trade networks. We're talking about what they called soft gold, Arctic fox, sable, and marten furs that were worth their weight in actual gold in European markets. They had access to walrus ivory, which was used for everything from artwork to practical tools. They controlled amber deposits from the Baltic and White Sea regions that were highly prized for jewelry and decoration. They had falcons that were perfect for hunting, and falconry was a huge status symbol among medieval nobility. And they had various medicinal and magical substances that were believed to have incredible powers. So there were 3 different patterns of interaction between Vikings and Bjarmians when it came to trade. First, there was direct trade at established market sites where both groups would observe religious truces and conduct business peacefully. Second, there was indirect trade through intermediaries, which allowed both groups to access each other's goods without having to interact directly. And third, and this is where things got really messy, there was trade raiding, where Vikings would try to bypass the normal trading channels and just take what they wanted by force. And this is where the gender dynamics get absolutely fascinating. The Bjarmians had women serving as shamans, chieftains, and military leaders, which was completely outside the Norse understanding of how society should work. Archaeological evidence shows female burials with shamanic tools, weapons, and leadership items that indicate these women held real power and authority. For Viking warriors who were used to dealing with women in very specific, limited roles, suddenly encountering women who were giving military orders and wielding spiritual authority was psychologically destabilizing. The Vikings' psychological defense mechanism was to attribute this female power to supernatural forces. Basically, they convinced themselves that Bjarmian women weren't really human women at all, but some kind of supernatural beings. And you can actually see the influence of these encounters in later Norse concepts of shield maidens and Valkyries, which suggests that contact with Bjarmian society actually changed how Vikings thought about gender and power. But all of this cultural and economic tension eventually led to what historians call the Battle of Sleeping Fires in 1026 CE, and you guys, this battle is absolutely insane. It represents the largest and most systematic attempt by any Viking leader to conquer Bjarmian territory. And the outcome was so devastating that it basically ended any serious Viking attempts at northern expansion. The whole thing started with King Olaf II, who decided he was going to solve the Bjarmian problem once and for all. This wasn't some minor raid or trading expedition. Olaf committed 15 ships and 500 warriors to this operation, which was absolutely massive by medieval standards. To put that in perspective, that's about the same size as the force that conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. So we're talking about a major military operation that represented a significant portion of Norwegian military resources. For the first 20 days, everything seemed to be going exactly according to plan. The Viking force encountered no resistance whatsoever. They found villages, but they were completely empty. No people, no resistance, no indication of where the Bjarmians had gone. The Vikings probably thought this was going to be the easiest conquest in their history. They were just going to sail in, occupy the territory, and establish Norwegian control over all those valuable resources. But of course, this was all part of an absolutely brilliant trap that the Bjarmians had been preparing for months, maybe even years. They had carefully orchestrated this entire scenario to draw the Vikings deeper and deeper into their territory, away from their ships, away from their supply lines, and into a location where the Bjarmians could use every single environmental and tactical advantage they possessed. The trap was sprung at a sacred lake. Modern historians think it was probably Lake Ionega, where the Bjarmians had constructed what appeared to be a wealthy settlement with gleaming roofs that would be visible from a distance. To the Vikings, this looked like the perfect target. a rich, undefended settlement that would provide both valuable loot and a strategic base for further operations. But when the Viking force approached this settlement, they walked into the most sophisticated military ambush in medieval European history. The Biarmians had concealed archer positions throughout the surrounding forest. They had dug underground passages that allowed fighters to appear and disappear seemingly at will, and they had prepared incendiary arrows with some kind of chemical compound that the Vikings described as unquenchable fire. Basically medieval napalm that would stick to everything it touched and couldn't be put out with water. The attack began with a devastating rain of incendiary arrows that set the Viking ships on fire and created chaos among the landing force. But that was just the beginning. As the Vikings tried to organize a response, Biarmian fighters began emerging from underground passages, striking with those silent spears and curved knives, and then disappearing back underground before the Vikings could react. The psychological effect of fighting an enemy who could literally appear and disappear at will was absolutely devastating to Viking morale. And then, the Biarmians revealed their masterstroke. They had constructed a river blockade that prevented the surviving Viking ships from escaping. The Vikings were trapped on land, surrounded by enemies they couldn't see or predict, with their escape route cut off and their ships burning behind them. But the Biarmians weren't done yet. They deployed what can only be described as medieval chemical warfare, using sulfur dioxide mist that created a choking, burning fog that made it impossible for the Vikings to see or breathe properly. Combined with the psychological terror of being attacked by invisible enemies in an alien environment, this chemical attack broke the remaining Viking resistance completely. The defeat was absolutely catastrophic. Out of 500 warriors who had landed, only about 60 survived to make it back to the two ships that weren't destroyed in the initial attack. That's a casualty rate of nearly 90%, which makes this one of the most devastating military defeats in Viking history. And the survivors who did make it back were so traumatized by the experience that most of them never spoke about what had happened, which is why this battle isn't well known today. But the really fascinating part is what happened after this massive defeat. Instead of seeking revenge or mounting another expedition, the Vikings basically just gave up on conquering Biarmian territory. Word of what had happened at the Battle of Sleeping Fires spread throughout the Norse world, and it created this understanding that Bjarmaland was simply off-limits to Viking expansion. The psychological impact of this defeat was so profound that it changed how Vikings thought about their own limitations and mortality. However, the story doesn't end there, because by the 12th and 13th centuries, the entire political and economic landscape of Northern Europe was changing in ways that made the old Viking-Biarmian conflict irrelevant. Christian kingdoms were consolidating their power. The Hanseatic League was creating new trade networks that bypassed traditional routes. And the eastward expansion of Novgorod was putting pressure on Biarmian territory from a completely different direction. The relationship bet. Ween Vikings and Biarmians evolved from direct confrontation to a much more complex form of interdependence. There was gradual normalization through integrated trading settlements where both groups could interact safely, cultural exchange that we can see in archaeological artifacts, and even Christian churches being built in Biarmian territories as part of the broader Christianization of Northern Europe. But this normalization came with external pressures that forced both groups to form pragmatic alliances against new threats. The old patterns of conflict became less relevant as both Vikings and Biarmians faced challenges from expanding kingdoms and changing trade routes that threatened their traditional ways of life. For the Biarmians, this period of change led to gradual cultural dissolution. They lost control of their traditional hunting territories as these areas were incorporated into expanding kingdoms. Their nomadic lifestyle became less viable, leading to more sedentary settlement patterns that changed their entire culture. Many Biarmians were absorbed into other ethnic groups or migrated to even more remote regions where they could maintain their traditional ways of life. The historical significance of this story goes way beyond just medieval military history. The Biarmian resistance to Viking expansion provides a counter-narrative to the simplistic view of Viking dominance that we often see in popular culture. It demonstrates that even the most formidable military powers can be successfully resisted by smaller groups who have superior environmental adaptation and unwavering determination. The Biarmians created a model of resistance that made domination cost prohibitively high for the Vikings. They didn't need to completely defeat the Viking military machine. They just needed to make conquest so expensive and traumatic that it wasn't worth pursuing. Their asymmetric warfare tactics, psychological operations, and environmental mastery created a situation where the Vikings could theoretically win any individual battle, but could never achieve the kind of decisive victory that would allow them to actually control Biarmian territory. This has modern relevance for understanding how interactions between dominant and smaller cultures can play out. The Biarmian example shows that cultural preservation doesn't always require conventional military victory. Sometimes it's enough to make resistance so effective and costly that the dominant culture decides to look elsewhere for easier targets. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the Biarmians challenges our assumptions about power and dominance in historical contexts. We tend to think of history as being written by the winners, but the Biarmian story suggests that sometimes the real winners are the ones who manage to avoid being written about at all. By maintaining their autonomy and cultural independence, even as they gradually faded from historical records, the Biarmians achieved a kind of victory that was more subtle but potentially more meaningful than conventional military conquest. The legacy of the Watchers in the White Forest represents something profound about the relationship between environment, culture, and resistance. These people understood that their harsh homeland could be transformed from a liability into their greatest asset. They developed technologies, tactics, and psychological strategies that were perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances, and they used these advantages to create a domain where even the most feared warriors of medieval Europe would tread with caution. The gradual fading of the Biarmians into legend and folklore represents a kind of historical amnesia that affects many similar stories. As political boundaries changed and new powers emerged, the specific details of Biarmian resistance were lost, but the psychological impact remained. The fear and respect that Vikings developed for the Far Yetas Orth persisted long after the specific reasons for that fear had been forgotten. Today, we can look at the Biarmian story as an example of how environmental understanding, cultural adaptation, and strategic thinking can allow smaller groups to successfully resist seemingly overwhelming forces. Their success wasn't based on superior numbers or better equipment. It was based on superior knowledge of their environment, better adaptation to local conditions, and more sophisticated understanding of psychological and asymmetric warfare. The enduring message of the Biarmians is that even the most formidable powers have limitations, and those limitations can be exploited by people who understand their own strengths and are willing to fight on their own terms rather than accepting the dominant paradigm of their opponents. In a world where we often assume that bigger, stronger, and more technologically advanced forces will always win, the Biarmian story reminds us that intelligence, adaptation, and determination can sometimes be more powerful than conventional military might. The mystery of Viking fear, it turns out, wasn't really a mystery at all. It was a rational response to encountering an opponent who had mastered forms of warfare that the Vikings couldn't understand or counter. The Biarmians had created something that was genuinely new in medieval European military history, a defensive strategy so effective that it didn't just protect their territory, it actually expanded their influence by creating a psychological barrier that was more powerful than any physical fortification. And so the story ends not with the dramatic final battle or the complete destruction of either side, but with the quiet transformation of conflict into coexistence, and eventually into the gradual absorption of both cultures into the larger patterns of European development. The Watchers in the White Forest faded into legend, but their legacy of successful resistance against overwhelming odds remains as a testament to the power of environmental mastery, cultural adaptation, and the refusal to accept that defeat is inevitable. This story challenges everything we think we know about medieval power dynamics, and it reminds us that history is full of these hidden narratives of resistance and survival that have been overlooked or forgotten. The Biarmians may have disappeared from the historical record, but their example of how smaller cultures can successfully resist dominant powers remains relevant today, offering insights into the complex relationships between environment, culture, technology, and the different forms that victory can take.